Hi everyone, this is Patrick Moore. I'm the director of the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh. I'm delighted to welcome you today to a very special event. It's part of our digital content series called Warhol at Home, and we're excited today to present this offering with Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures. My thanks to Stephanie Flum from Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures and her team. They've been a great partner. This offering with Blake Gopnik and looking at his new book, Warhol, the Biography, is part of our efforts to continue to engage our audience here in Pittsburgh and around the world in the museum until we can welcome you back physically into our space. We found that there's such a strong response to these offerings that we intend to keep them up long after we welcome you back to our museum and to see our collection. And we hope that it will continue to grow our global engagement. Today, as I said, is a very special opportunity to celebrate Blake Gopnik's achievement with Warhol, this mighty tome that he has written that examines Warhol's life and work. And Blake has become a part of the museum family here in Pittsburgh because he spent so much time researching the book in Pittsburgh and specifically in our archives at the Warhol Museum. The thing that I really admire about Blake's book is that although it has something to offer from every aspect of Warhol's life, Blake really did a lot of original research into Warhol's life here in Pittsburgh. There's a reason that the Warhol Museum is in Pittsburgh. We believe that the experience and context of this immigrant city where Warhol grew up is critical to a kind of nuanced understanding of his work. And Blake really explores Pittsburgh, the era in which Warhol emerged from Pittsburgh, and the incredible immigrant experience that was unique to Warhol. The book for me is as important for its facts as much as interpretation. Blake, because he's a fantastic journalist, has really looked at the facts throughout Warhol's life rather than focusing, in my opinion, on interpretation. And because there have been so many stories about Warhol and so much fascination with him, it's really critical that there be a kind of definitive source that looks at Warhol and that people can turn to when trying to understand his life. This book is very accessible for a wide audience, but I think it also has a lot that will be useful for the professional audience of Warhol scholars, professionals, people in the commercial world, on and on and on. So I really congratulate Blake and thank him for his work on this book. Today, Blake is going to be taking us through the stages of Warhol's life, telling us a bit about his development through his life and through his work. So again, thank you to Blake, thank you to Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures, and please enjoy. Blake, take it away.
Andy Warhol lived through 7 decades of the 20th century. He was born on August 6, 1928, which means that he didn't do a whole lot in the 1920s. But in researching my Warhol biography, I realized there was actually a lot that mattered about where he was born and who he was born to. So in a way, the 1920s do matter for his life. He was born in a neighborhood called Soho in Pittsburgh, and it was poorer than poor. I made this great discovery, or at least for me it was a discovery, of a book called The Pittsburgh Survey, which was published in the teens of the last century, and was, they say, the first sort of systematic urban sociology, the first systematic study of a city. And half of the book is about the working class in Pittsburgh and how important that is, as though the working class in Pittsburgh stood for the working class everywhere. So Warhol's born into this world where the working class matters and where being working class has a special status. But one of the interesting things about the Pittsburgh Survey, one of the things it taught me, is that the working class in Pittsburgh was very much cut up into ethnic divisions, if you like. There were the Italian Americans, there were the Irish Americans, there were the Scottish Americans, especially at a special status, because the most famous Pittsburgher of all, Andrew Carnegie, who of course became one of the great billionaires of his era, was Scottish. So that gave them a special kind of status, and that's clear even in the even in the Pittsburgh survey. But Warhol came from a group that actually didn't have a stable ethnic identity. His family had come over pretty recently from an area that's now on the border between Slovakia and Poland. And it's now we call them the Carpatho-Rusins. We've given them an ethnic name, but at the time they didn't actually have a stable identity the way the other people in Pittsburgh did, the way the other ethnic groups in Pittsburgh did. They called themselves people like us. They didn't have a name for what they were. And in the Pittsburgh survey, they're called Ruthenians and Russians and Slavs. It's all kind of interchangeable because no one could pigeonhole this particular group. That's who Andy Warhol, that was the group he was born into. They didn't even have a name for their dialect, their Slavic dialect. They just referred to their language as the way we talk. So Andy's born into this world of hyphenated Americans, of Italian Americans, of Irish Americans, but he's got nothing to put before the American in his name. Doesn't know how to hyphenate himself, in a sense. And it turns out that what really matters for the rest of Warhol's life and his career as an artist is not, in a sense, that he belonged to the Carpatho-Rusins, but that he didn't belong anywhere, that he was an outsider, or at least for the rest of America. And for himself, he was an outsider in American culture. And being an outsider in modern art was a kind of signature position. Modern art loved outsider artists. It loved the notion of being separate from the rest of the culture. Modern art is all about being different, being special. And Warhol's youth in the 1920s in Pittsburgh, Warhol's birth in the 1920s in Pittsburgh, gave him that very special outsider status. One of the things that surprised me when I was researching my book was that in the 1930s already, Andy Warhol's second decade of life, he already knows about serious contemporary art. And that really was one of the interesting discoveries for me about Andy Warhol. And that was because it turned out already in grade school that he was surprisingly good at art compared to the other students. And that meant that he could go and join on the weekends, on Saturdays. He could give up his Saturdays playing with the other boys, as they phrased it at the time, and take these lessons. They were called the tam o' shanter lessons, probably because the traditional Scottish hat, the tam o' shanter, reminded people of an artist's beret. They were art lessons for hundreds and hundreds of kids in Pittsburgh. All the kids who showed any talent for art at all ended up at these lessons, and they were given at the Carnegie Museum of Art. So Warhol, from an incredibly young age, from probably 8 or 9 years old, had these art lessons. They were very serious art lessons. They weren't just for fun. They were really meant to see if there might be a great artist in Pittsburgh. And they taught them, all the basics of composition, etc. But what I think was even more important about those lessons than the fact that he learned skills was that they took place in this art museum. And that meant that he got to see all the shows. And the art museum in Pittsburgh, the Carnegie Museum of Art, had a surprisingly good and exciting and interesting roster of shows. It got a lot of shows in, even from the Museum of Modern Art. It showed modern art, which you don't necessarily expect for Pittsburgh in the 1930s. They even got the Great Picasso show from MoMA, the Great Picasso retrospective. And the greatest picture in it, Guernica, came from New York to Pittsburgh, and Warhol would have got to see it. So later in life, he has a clear competition with Picasso to see who's going to be the greatest artist of the 20th century. He even wears Picasso's striped shirts. The signature Picasso shirt becomes Warhol's signature as well. But he's exposed to Picasso already when he's a kid in Pittsburgh. Not just that, but every year, the Carnegie Museum of Art had a very important show, sometimes called the International, but during the war years, when Warhol was coming of age, it was called the Annual, and it only showed American art. And in a sense, that fact alone proved to Warhol, or suggested to Warhol, that being an American artist could also mean that you were an important artist. All of a sudden, the first contemporary art he sees is American contemporary art, and it sets up the possibility, at least, of being important in modern art and being American. And because the Carnegie Annual was a tiny bit maybe behind the times, it tended to show figurative modern art rather than abstraction. And it showed a lot of art with a social conscience. So those two things, being a figurative artist and making art that involves the social world, were things that Warhol was already exposed to in in his childhood as he took these sort of goofy traditional art lessons. There also did a show of artist self-portraits, and of course he goes on to be one of the great self-portraitists of the later 20th century. So he's exposed to all of these different ideas of what art can be already at the Carnegie Museum of Art. Lest anyone think, so they had shows like this, did Warhol see them, or was he just sitting in the auditorium taking these art lessons? Well, it turns out that part of the art lesson was to go and actually draw the works in these exhibitions. And maybe one of my very favorite discoveries when I was researching my book was a photograph of the Tam O'Shanter kids in one of the halls of one of the American painting annuals that they had, art annuals that they had every year. And in this photograph of these kids drawing, you see a little boy, maybe 12 years old, a little taller than the other kids because he's a bit older maybe, and he's got a forelock of blonde hair, which was Warhol's signature hairdo at the time. And I've convinced myself, I don't know if I can convince anyone else, but I've convinced myself that there we have a photograph of Andy Warhol drawing the best contemporary art in America at that moment, predicting, in a sense, his own place in exhibitions like that are going to be coming pretty soon. Warhol's third decade of life in the 20th century was, of course, the 1940s. And what's really striking for me about what happened in the 1940s is that he discovered not just art, not just good art, but really amazingly radical avant-garde art. Now, from our point of view, you don't think of Pittsburgh necessarily as being a haven for the most daring art of its time. But in fact, it turns out by pure fluke that in the 1940s, Pittsburgh was a hotbed for at least the consumption of radical art because of this one place, this one gallery called Outlines Gallery that opened up in 1941 and showed all of the most important art really that you could see in North America. It was as good a gallery as anywhere. It was really a kind of mini Museum of Modern Art. And in fact, it actually borrowed a lot of shows and art from the Museum of Modern Art. So Warhol got to see the films of Jean Cocteau, which turned out to be a huge influence on him, as the drawings of Jean Cocteau were as well. He gets to see them at Outlines Gallery in Pittsburgh. Photography is shown as an art form at Outlines Gallery in Pittsburgh, something that wasn't really happening very much anywhere else in the world. They did performances of plays by Gertrude Stein. Calder's Circus, Alexander Calder's Circus, has one of its first appearances in Pittsburgh. Maybe most important of all for Warhol, they actually give a 1-month residency to John Cage and Merce Cunningham. John Cage, the great avant-garde composer of the second half of the 20th century, and Merce Cunningham, one of the greatest choreographers and dancers. They appear in Pittsburgh thanks to Outlines, and they appear, and this is important, as a romantic couple for one of the first times. So Warhol gets to see a gay couple in the avant-garde doing amazing things at just the moment that he was probably figuring out that he was a gay youngster. Now, brilliantly for Warhol, Outlines closes in 46. That's a terrible shame, but that's exactly when he's just recently arrived at Carnegie Tech, the Carnegie Institute of Technology, where he went to art school. He got a scholarship to go to art school. And it was just as good as Outlines was. It turns out that for those few years that Warhol was there, it was probably maybe the best art school in North America, certainly one of the best art schools, purely by a kind of weird chance. I got to see the course notes of his professors. I got to look through the minutes of faculty meetings, and this is all at what's now Carnegie Mellon University. They have an archives. And I found these amazing notes explaining even that the students were in advance of the professors. They wanted to do radical avant-garde film when the professors didn't even know what it was all about. They were fascinated by Dada art, by Marcel Duchamp. The most radical artist of the 20th century was a kind of hero for the students at Carnegie Tech at that moment. In fact, 2 of Warhol's classmates go on to do MAs, art history MAs, specifically about Dada artists. So Warhol is at what sounds like it should be a provincial university, but gets this amazing training in the most radical contemporary art. And by his second or third year, certainly by his last year, by his senior year, he's a clear star of the art department. He doesn't do what anyone else does. He won't listen to what he's supposed to do. He doesn't turn in the assignments he's supposed to turn into. And that, given the ethos of modern art, makes him a star. He changes his name to Andre So he becomes an official bohemian by virtue of having a French name. But he becomes this amazing figure already invested in the idea of a radical avant-garde. And he gets that because of Carnegie Tech, because of Outlines Gallery, because of living in Pittsburgh in the 1940s. But it's also important, I think, to realize that something else happens to him at that same time, in that same moment in the middle of the 40s. And that is that he pretty clearly adopts a gay identity, or discovers his own gay identity. It turns out that was already happening in high school for him, before he even gets to Carnegie Tech. I found notes from a high school bully, actually, who bullied him and said we used to refer to Warhol as a queer, and talks about how he carried his books in an effeminate way and loafed, he said loafed, with other boys like him in Shenley Park, a corner of Shenley Park. Now, that corner of Shenley Park eventually got to be called the Fruit Loop, obviously in derogatory terms, because that was the cruising zone for gays in Pittsburgh. So Warhol adopts the ethos of the avant-garde, becomes an official bohemian, and discovers that he's gay at the same time. And I think for him, the two things were linked together, maybe partly because of John Cage and Merce Cunningham appearing in Pittsburgh as a gay couple. But what it turns out, that sounds very positive in a way, a positive model for what it was to be gay in Pittsburgh. But it turns out it was actually terrifying. Pittsburgh was possibly the worst place to be gay in North America, or as bad as anywhere, because just when Warhol is coming of age, they form something called the Police Morals Squad. And morals sounds kind of generic, but its only job was to ferret out gays, to persecute homosexuals. And they did a really good job of it. In the first 2 weeks this squad existed, they shot 2 gay men. And then they went on over subsequent years to extort money from them, to beat them up. It was really a nightmare to be gay in Pittsburgh. And yet this is the moment when Warhol's coming out. This is the moment where his identity as a gay avant-gardist becomes important to him, I think. So the perils and joys of a gay identity come together at the same time for him. And I think that combination, that tension, is what actually powers a lot of the art he makes for the next decades until his death in 1987. In the 1950s, Andy Warhol was mostly a commercial illustrator. That's how he made a very, very good living. He wasn't a famous illustrator, but he was well enough known. That's how most people who know about Warhol think about the 50s, and I did too when I started writing my book. But in doing the research, I found an area that actually interested me more, and that was his work as a window dresser. Didn't do a lot of it, but he did a fair amount. He was a freelancer, mostly for a department store called Bonwit Tellers, which was run, whose windows were run, I should say, by a man called Gene Moore, who was famous really across the country for the quality of his windows, because windows actually could make a man famous. We've lost track of this now, but in the 40s and 50s, window dressing was a really major cultural phenomenon. People would line up. They changed the windows every week in New York department stores, and people would line up Tuesday nights to see the paper come off the windows to see what was inside, what the latest windows were. And that was partly because they were done with real creative flair, and in fact, they were often done by artists. Salvador Dali did windows. The sculptor Archipenko did windows as well in New York. So it was known that windows could be a fairly serious place to look at art. And in the 50s, window dressers would put abstract expressionist paintings behind the mannequins that they were showing their merchandise on, the clothing on. And it was never clear whether the paintings were props mostly or whether they were works of fine art. Those categories were dissolved in windows in a way they weren't anywhere else. Illustration, it was pretty clear there were things that were illustrations and things that were works of fine art, and there wasn't a lot of overlap between them. There were fine artists who did illustration, but it was often quite different from the work they would do for themselves. Window dressing in the 50s left a lot more room to move. And the fact that Warhol was doing it meant that those categories of fine and popular were already dissolving before he even got to pop art, where they officially dissolve. The other thing that's interesting about window dressing in New York in the 1950s is that it was a special haven for gay men like Warhol. It was a place where you could be creative, where you could have a social life, where you could meet like-minded people who were all gay. Not every single window dresser was gay, but that was the dominant cultural group that was there. So it mattered a lot for Warhol, both aesthetically and culturally. And you can find out a lot about the windows that Warhol did because they're preserved, the drawings, I should say, photographs and drawings for them, are preserved in the archives at the Andy Warhol Museum. So you can get a really nice sense of what his windows were like. And one of the images I came across, one of the photographs I came across, came from January of 1956, when the windows were a little different than usual because they were explicitly given over to the fine art work by the window dressers who normally dressed windows for Bonwit Teller. And there they are in January, because of course, in January, most of the selling of Christmas is already over, so you can afford to put less important displays in the window. In January, stranger displays of officially fine art. So Warhol's in this one window, and he shows three quite meek and mild drawings behind the mannequin in front of them. And they're frankly a little disappointing. You can hardly make them out. When you do make them out, you realize they're just a kind of relatively generic derivation from his commercial illustration. Really not very interesting at all. But what makes them important, what makes them interesting to me, is that in digging further in other archives and in books, I realized that the windows next door to the one that Warhol did were filled by two other occasional window dressers for Bonwit Teller. And it so happens their names were Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg, two of the very most important artists of that moment in New York, who were just coming into their own as post-abstract artists. They were doing the first kind of proto-pop art. And in the window next to Warhol's, there's Jasper Johns showing one of his first great flag paintings, which is really just an American flag on a canvas. So it's already appropriating things straight out of pop culture and presenting them as fine art, just as Warhol did in the 60s, obviously. And then next door to that is Robert Rauschenberg with one of his first Combine paintings, one of his first assemblages attached to a canvas. So here you get two of the most important works of the 1950s in these windows at Bonwit Teller's, and Warhol is not showing the most important work of the 1950s. He still hasn't figured out what he wanted to do. But he's next door to these two rivals, who, as it happens, were also a gay couple. He's next door to these rivals of his. And I think that position, literally in that window, but also sociologically, aesthetically, was an impetus for him to try harder, to move further, to do something more exciting. And that's what happens in the early 1960s. In fact, in 1961, in April, he shows his first real pop art paintings in a window at the department store, essentially at Bonwit Teller, another department store they just bought called Gunther Jekyll. So there he is, showing his pop art for the first time. It happens in a department store, and then things take off from there. Thinking about Andy Warhol in the 1960s is weirdly difficult because everything he did is too well known. It's very hard to get excited about things you've seen a million times. So there are the soup can paintings, the movie star paintings, the Brillo box sculptures, the endless films of the Empire State Building and his boyfriend sleeping, even his promotion of the Velvet Underground, the rock band. It all feels sort of too familiar, so it's kind of hard to write about in a fresh way or to think about in a fresh way or even, as I said, to get excited about. But looking through Andy Warhol's archives, I realized that there was a kind of undercurrent of a different, more complicated work, less sellable work, for one thing. Work that was much more part of a kind of conceptual avant-garde, if you like, where he's really experimenting with different options. And some of them never came to anything because they were probably too experimental in a sense, even for him. For instance, in the very early 1960s, and we only have fragments of information about these early pieces, he does paintings that are produced just by putting canvas in front of his front door and letting people step on it, and that would generate the painting. It's a kind of process painting, as it was called much later in the 1960s. Or he made his first piss paintings in the very early 1960s, where he tested what it would be, instead of using a brush in oils or a brush in acrylics, what would it be to make an abstract painting by just peeing on a piece of canvas? And unfortunately, some of those survive with yellow stains on them. In 1963, he formed a rock band called the Drudds, but it was unlike any rock band you could imagine. It feels much more like something from the 70s or even one of the stranger new wave bands from the 80s. It's not really a band at all. It's a completely conceptual project. They rehearsed together, but it was really wacky. A few tapes survive. I've heard them, and they're pretty strange. Much stranger than the Velvet Underground. I mean, the Velvet Underground, the most radical rock band possibly of the 60s, feel like a kind of normal rock band compared to Warhol's Druds. He makes proper porn films, proper gay porn films as well, never meant for public display, obviously. In his archives, there are little scraps of information. There's a book of ideas, 50 photographs of a man having an orgasm. The same script read by two different actresses, it says. There's documents of him trying to get a theatrical prop maker to make him a chair that looks as though it floats, that you can put a big ring around to prove that it's floating. It's a kind of classic magician's chair, but there's actually a quote, an estimate from this prop maker for this chair, and you wonder, what was he thinking? What was he going to do with this chair? He makes, or plans to make, wants to make, tries to make a trash can that is robotic, that you clap your hands and it comes to you and opens to receive the trash. Probably the most successful, though, and I think interesting and influential project he did is at the very end of the 60s, in 1969. It's a project that has the name Raid the Icebox, and what it consisted of was him raiding, as it were, the icebox of the museum at the Rhode Island School of Design. And what he did was, he was invited to come and curate from their collection. And that was a fairly radical idea at the time. Nowadays, it happens all the time. The Museum of Modern Art invites an artist. They come and they choose whatever works they like best, often slightly unusual works, to bring up from the vaults to freshen things up. That was unusual, even in 1969, doing even that. But Warhol goes way further than that. He goes in the vaults and basically pulls out all the stuff that wasn't art. He pulls out a whole chest full of old shoes. I mean, they were vaguely interesting from the point of view of costume design, but they were never meant to be shown all together in their original cabinet, in this scruffy cabinet that they were just being stored in the basement. He takes the sandbags that are used to prop up paintings, to protect paintings in the basement, and he wants those shown as art as well. The museum had a bunch of old Windsor chairs, which they had bought just to have replacement parts for the good Windsor chairs they had. Guess what? He shows those dozen, or however many it is, Windsor chairs as works of art. That has since become something that artists do. They take stranger things from the vaults of a museum. But it was most famous in the early 90s. It became a thing to do, but Warhol was already doing it in 1969. And weirdly, this is a major project. It toured the country. But it's so eccentric that it doesn't seem to have impinged a whole lot, even on the world of professional art historians. They talk about it, they write a bit about it, but I think it's actually one of his most exciting, strange, and influential works. And yet, like so much by Warhol, it gets overpowered, overshadowed by the easier, more sellable works like the Campbell soup cans and the Marilyn paintings. We all know Andy Warhol from the 1970s. He's famous as a gadabout at that point. He becomes a jet setter. He flies to Paris. He has an apartment he stays in Paris. He takes the Concorde as soon as that's available. He's hanging out with upper crust dealers and especially with upper crust portrait sitters who'll pay him a fortune to do their portraits. That's how he starts to become rich. And by 1970 already, so he's just 2 years after being shot, he buys himself a Mercedes SE, a 280 SE, a beautiful car. Spends $9,000 on it, which was a lot of money in 1970. He's already living the high life. And then just a few years later, he spends $30,000 on a 2-ton Rolls Royce. Really buys a beautiful car. And we have receipts for all this, so we know exactly what model number they were, how much he spent, how fancy they were. They were customized like crazy, stereos, everything you could want in a 1970s car. But the funny thing about that is he didn't know how to drive, so we had to get other people to drive his car. But in a way, that famous Andy isn't the one that I discovered or the one that was most interesting to me when I was digging into the 1970s. The one that surprised me and that interested me is much more homebody Andy Warhol, because he lived with the same man for the entire course of the 1970s. He moved in, this young man, a little younger than we would think was appropriate today. I think he was 19. Moved in late 1968 to help nurse Warhol back to life after he'd been shot. And this man, Jed Johnson, lives with Warhol in the same room, sharing a bed for the rest of the 1970s. So the notion of Andy Warhol as kind of some kind of remote cold fish, asexual, just doesn't hold up. As far as I can tell, neither Jed nor Andy were crazy about sex, but they definitely had sex. They were a relatively normal couple. They were loving in public, even in front of journalists. There's a journalist who talks about how loving they seem to be. So Andy has a fairly normal, nice home life. Jed is a very quiet young man, pretty much under Warhol's thumb and under Warhol's shadow for sure. He's also a depressive, probably clinically depressive. He tries to commit suicide twice, and we know that for sure, partly because his brother told me about it, but also because the hospital bills that Warhol paid survive for both of the attempts. But there was clearly real love and affection there. It wasn't the easiest relationship in the world. I don't think any or most gay men didn't have easy relationships in the 1970s. Most people don't have easy relationships ever. But there was clearly real love there, real old-fashioned romantic love between the two of them, I think. And Jed had an important role as well in Warhol's aesthetic life because he introduced the notion of high taste and refined taste and period taste and great antiques to Warhol, and that became very much how he decorated at home. In fact, it was Jed who really decorated for him. They eventually got a very fancy house on the Upper East Side on 66th Street, and Jed decorated that for Warhol. Warhol spent, again, a fortune on that as well. So he really moved up into high society, but Jed Johnson had a notion of refined taste that Warhol hadn't had before. And that was an important contribution to Andy Warhol's life, I think. Like any relationship, it came to an end. At the end of the 70s, they were relatively estranged. Jed Johnson actually left Warhol for another man, who he clearly had a better relationship with. But Warhol had also been, if not fooling around, at any rate looking around and pinching around at Studio 54. So they had grown apart. But Warhol's clearly crushed when Jed Johnson leaves him. And there's a really touching Victorian Christmas card that Jed sends to Andy in Christmas of 1980. And it says, "Andy, I don't know what you're looking for. Sorry you didn't find it at home. You did have all my love and respect. I'm sorry it went wrong. Thinking of you with sincere love, Jed." And then Warhol's diary entries about Jed leaving him are really terribly sad. Warhol was crushed by this. A lot of people still think that the 1980s were a kind of dead decade for Andy Warhol, or at least for Andy Warhol, the artist. They imagine that there's a huge fall off from the great work of the 1960s, from the pop work of the early 60s. I, for one, just don't buy that, even though people have actually gone after my book for being too generous with Warhol's late work. But it seems to me that in the particular context of the reactionary political and artistic world of the 1980s, he's really responding to that. He's responding to that as much as he was responding to 60s consumerism. It was an age when everyone was talking about a return to painting and even a return to traditional painting. And it seems to me that the best of his 80s works are actually commenting on that very notion. So they're really engaged with the art that's being made in a pretty critical way. I mean, the works that I like from the mid-80s are his giant Rorschach block paintings, which look like huge Rorschach blots. I mean, I'm talking 8-10 feet tall Rorschach blots. Funnily enough, when I was looking through his college psychology textbook, he was obliged to take a psych course. One of the only images in the whole book is, in fact, a Rorschach blot, which had been made by the author of the book. And it says in the caption that he couldn't get one of the original Rorschach blots because, in fact, those were copyrighted. So he had to make his own. And then Andy, all those years later, is making his own giant Rorschach blots. What is a Rorschach blot except something that's about expression, but it's a kind of fake expression because the blot itself has no content and you have to read into it. That seems to me a pretty good comment on the new expressionism of 80s painting. And of course, a Rorschach blot is a kind of automatic painting, a painting you don't think about at all. Whereas the painting of the 80s was supposed to be all about real expression again, really revealing your soul. And if there's anything a Rorschach blot as a blot doesn't do is reveal anyone's soul, because of course it's supposed to reveal everyone's soul. Everyone comes to it with a different soul. Then he makes, a little bit later, he makes these giant camouflage paintings. They're abstract pictures. What's more abstract than a camouflage pattern? And he uses real camouflage patterns to silkscreen onto his canvases. But of course, they're also absolutely a picture of something, namely a picture of a camouflage pattern. And the camouflage pattern itself is bizarre because its goal is not to be seen, right? It's the one human pictorial creation that you're not supposed to be able to see, and yet Warhol is holding it up as that thing you're supposed to see more than anything else, that is a painting, and especially an abstract painting, which you're supposed to study at length, right? Just what you're not supposed to even be able to do with camouflage paintings. With camouflage, I should say, with real camouflage that used to hide objects in nature. So that's really serious work. Not everything he did in the 80s was serious and great, but not everything he did in the 60s was serious and great. And in fact, there isn't a single artist in the entire history of Western art who only made good work, or rather, I should say, there's no artist who didn't make a lot of bad work as well as good work. But it's important to recognize, everyone talks about, there have even been shows called The Late Work of Andy Warhol, but he never got to make late work, right? You realize when you study him that he was only in his 50s in the 1980s when he's, in theory, making his late work. Maybe he had another 30 years of even greater work left. Maybe he had a late Goya moment, a late Titian moment. We'll never know. Because absurdly, in February of 1987, he'd let his health go badly. He hadn't treated this ridiculous gallbladder he had. His father had a gallbladder infection as well, had his gallbladder removed. Warhol had friends who had their gallbladders removed perfectly successfully, but he refused to allow the operation to happen. Then, he was shot in 1968 by a crazy hanger-on, and that really destroyed his body, did a real number on him. So he's let himself go. He's sick as a dog. He goes in for what people called, and still call, a routine operation, but it wasn't. He was too damaged a body for it to be routine. In fact, no operation where they put you to sleep and open you up is really routine in any normal sense. It's not walking to the corner store. He had the bad luck that many people probably might have had, still have after an operation. He's one of those people who died pretty much mysteriously. His heart stopped after the operation, and one of the greatest, most varied, longest careers in the history of Western art was cut even shorter than it should have been, just because of this stupid fluke. But luckily for biographers like me, he left behind a plenty long enough life. I wouldn't hope that he had a longer life. My book is plenty long without needing another 10 chapters to deal with the late Andy Warhol. So I'm thankful and eternally blessed at having had a chance to write Andy Warhol's life, all 7 decades of it.
Thanks, Blake. That was terrific. We really appreciate your partnership with the museum, and I'm so impressed by your incredible knowledge of Warhol. Thanks for sharing it with us. Our thanks again to Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures and Stephanie Flom and her team, and to remind you that Blake's book is available at the Warhol store for purchase, as well as on many other platforms. Most importantly, I want to invite you to come and visit the Andy Warhol Museum and to see some of the work that Blake told you about today, and to visit us in Pittsburgh when it is possible to do that, and to see the amazing collection here at the Andy Warhol Museum. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we will have lots more content for you as we go along. Thanks.